Hi everyone, I'm John Ivison, your host as we take a look at the week's political follies. Joining me are Marcella Munro, who is the owner-operator of WPM Public Affairs, and Andrew Balfour, who's a managing partner at Rubicon Strategies. Okay, so this week we will take stock of the pandemic. We will ask where political power really lies in Canada, and then we'll go back to my native Scotland, where it is election day today, and see who is likely to win in the Scottish parliamentary elections in Edinburgh. First off, there's this, I don't know if people have seen it, but there's this wildly optimistic new chewing gum ad for Extra that says in the not too distant future people will lay aside their treasured possessions like toilet paper and laptops and will go out and meet people. So it suggests that the marketing industry at least is looking ahead, whereas a poll for the National Post this week suggested 2/3 of people think things will get worse before they get better. The poll also said that a majority would wait until next year before they tried birthday cake where somebody had blown out the candles. So, Andrew, given it's your birthday on Monday, and I can safely say that Satan will be skating to work before I eat any cake that you've blown on, given the state of the infection numbers and where we are with vaccines, would you go with the marketing industry and the gum advert, or with the more pessimistic predictions from Post readers?
I don't know. I don't think that things are going to get worse. Like, what more can happen? Like, I can't go do anything. Like, how does it get worse? Vaccine numbers are going up everywhere in the country, with the exception of Alberta. Numbers seem to be, well, in some other smaller provinces, things are getting better. I disagree with the average Canadian, clearly.
Well, the numbers, I mean, all the indicators seem to be moving in the right direction. We've got fewer than 8,000 cases across the country, less than 3,000 a day in Ontario. The R reproduction number is below 1 in Ontario, and Quebec's had, I think, the lowest 7-day average since March. Alberta is a point of concern. The reproduction number is still above 1, and the P1 variant is almost as high in Alberta as it is in British Columbia. What do you think, Marcella? Is there room for optimism, or should we still be on guard?
Well, I would like to say I'm more optimistic, but I think it's hard to be. And I think for your average Canadian, just this constant avalanche of COVID coverage, even though, you know, some of it right now is vaccines, just keeps reminding us that we've had a super tough year and that there's a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety in the system. So I think we shouldn't be shocked that Canadians are expressing that. You know, I've been working with Polera for some other polling for a prosperity project, and we know, and we've known for 8 months, that the levels of anxiety and stress and mental health and exhaustion that most Canadians are feeling right now is super high. I also think that if you happen to be in some of the hardest hit areas where there's these dense populations of people who have been really economically walloped, and yet they have to still be going to work, you know, seeing what's happened in places like Brampton, for example, you know, those working class Canadians aren't out of the woods yet, right? Their jobs aren't safe yet. So I think we've still got a long way to go, and I think governments at some point will have to turn their attention to, like, how do we come out of the COVID PTSD that I think a lot of Canadians are feeling.
Segueing into the political side of the pandemic, this week was not a banner week for anybody, but particularly for the Federal Health Minister, I would argue. The Advisory Committee on Vaccines came out and said there were preferred vaccines, almost as if there's a two-tier system. And Patty Hydew was asked, should people pick and choose their vaccines or take the first one offered? And she said, well, people should consult with their doctors. Now, this is serious stuff. Angus Reid had polled opinions on AstraZeneca back in March when the blood clot issue first came up, and almost, I think, half were very hesitant about taking AstraZeneca. Then there was a concerted effort by doctors and politicians to say, take the first vaccine you're offered. And that number fell by 11 points. And now we've got the health minister, again, not being clear. She was clear the following day, but I think Canadians are getting whiplash, and it suggests that somehow politicians, particularly cabinet ministers, are are not responsible for their actions. They're not accountable for their actions. What do you think, Marcella?
It's just been a mess this week with all the different messaging around the vaccinations. I, for the life of me, do not understand why we need NACI to hold public press conferences and do media interviews as well. It seems to me that Health Canada and the ministers should be enough. I also think everyone's, it's a bit much too to think that politicians day after day need to comment on these issues. They're not the ones, that should be setting this kind of health policy. But to your point about the ministerial responsibility stuff, I mean, I don't really know that we have that right now in Canada. It seems to me, and I sort of said this last week, it seems to me that, we have a defense minister that, in my view, should have resigned already, right? He's not taking responsibility for harassment problems and not being able to fix that system in the CAF. And he's been there for 5 or 6 years. So, that's a pretty good example. And then Minister Haidu should have known better by now. Like the fact that she had to walk it back. I mean, we're in month 16 of this pandemic and she can't get her message straight around vaccinations. So yeah, it's messy, it's concerning, and it's just gonna continue to harm Canadian sense of trust as we get through this.
Andrew, we've got Sagen in a very sticky spot on this sexual misconduct issue, and yet the opposition is calling for the head of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford. Is that telling on where political power really resides in this country? I mean, Donald Savoy has written numerous books on this, but the idea that there's a kind of coterie of unelected advisors around the Prime Minister who really control the country, and cabinet is really just an appendage. Is that is that something you agree with?
Well, I mean, I think that just given the size of the government of Canada and the number of departments, the number of agencies, that it's foolish to suggest that the Prime Minister's office could be in control of everything. There's like roughly 100 people in PMO. I'm sorry, but they can't run everything. So ministers do have a job, and there is still ministerial responsibility. But just jumping back to what you're talking about vaccines, I mean, the Prime Minister going and getting AstraZeneca, Doug Ford getting AstraZeneca, like half the cabinet seemed to have gotten AstraZeneca. So it is odd to me that anyone in elected office is mincing or messing up their words around this. Like, get the first vaccine that's offered to you is like the pretty basic talking point. I don't know how you screw that up. And like, our firm does a lot of media training, and it's pretty obvious to me that those people at NACI don't even know what media training is. Like, they're terrible. Right. And yeah, thankfully that one lady's term is coming up, or maybe all their terms are coming up, and they're just going to be a little footnote in the book on COVID down the road.
I think to your point, though, about Telford, I mean, look, I think it was a wrong move by the Conservatives to go after her. Not because I think she's infallible or that she shouldn't be held to account, but merely to reinforce what I think your point on ministerial responsibility. Like, if you're going to make the case that the government needs to be defeated, you should probably spend your time going after the MPs of the sitting government, right? Like, why not double down on calling for the resignation of Sagen? Why try to turn the dial to be about the Chief of Staff? It doesn't make any sense.
I mean, is there a case to be made on that point, though, that there are requirements from all governments to satisfy gender, geography, ethnicity requirements, with the end result that we are governed by people who, many of whom have been over-promoted? Is that a fair comment?
I'm a white dude, so it's hard for me to comment on that. But there certainly, even prior to there needing to be things around ethnicity and gender, cabinets have always been made around geography. I mean, there's got to be people from here and there. So there are those considerations to be made. And when you're building a cabinet, you can't have every single person from Bay Street.
Yeah, I think cabinets have to look like the population as much as you can, right? So, if the question is, does the Liberal bench have enough strength to put enough diversity and a bunch of experience into their cabinet? I would say the answer is probably yes. I think the real question with Sagen and some of the people that follow defense more closely is, was it a mistake putting someone in the position of DND, which we've known for years is rife with is rife with internal problems, who was a former CAF officer. Like, is it too much of a conflict of interest? And can we expect someone who was basically promoted and raised in that culture to be the guy who's going to fix it, right? So I don't think that that's about race or gender or anything else. It's who needs to be in that position if your goal is to reform the culture.
I think that's right. There is also when you get into the second term, and inevitably you've lost some of your stronger players. I mean, in this government's case, I think there wouldn't be any dissent at suggesting that Jane Philpott would have been a welcome Minister of Defence during a pandemic. Jody Wilson-Raybould, even Bill Munro was I think, he may not have been a great communicator, but he was a reasonably solid Minister of Finance.
I don't think you're going to find anyone in this government who thinks that Jody Wilson-Raybould should be doing anything. But just quickly on the...
I think she should run for mayor of Vancouver, but that's another conversation.
But just quickly on the part of the Conservatives bringing up the chief of staff issue, and you brought up the Donald Savoy books and him talking about how this all started with Trudeau Sr., but it's a bit rich for a bunch of people who were in the cabinet and the caucus of the man who took centralization of government to the greatest level ever, for them to be going and pointing fingers now.
But Trudeau promised, as in many other areas, to be completely different and to roll back that centralization of power, and I don't think we've seen that, right?
Oh, that's not the comment I was making. I was just throwing a ball at the silliness.
All right, I'll let you fudge that issue, Andrew, and let's cross the Atlantic. Election day in Scotland, 129 members of the Scottish Parliament to be elected. There is not really much doubt about who's going to win, because the Scottish National Party, which is pro-independence, is well ahead in the polls. It's been governing since 2007. It's judged to have handled the pandemic. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, is judged to have handled the pandemic relatively well. The question is whether they win a convincing majority, and if they do, whether they can force Boris Johnson to give them another independence referendum. Any takers on how this is likely to play out?
Well, I mean, you're right. She's obviously going to win. We'll see. I mean, the whole way that this is shaking out with the results not coming till Saturday, and the voting's already it's so weird, and then them having this rule that they can't count ballots overnight because of COVID. It's I'm less likely to catch COVID during the day than I am at night. I didn't quite understand that part, but no, I mean, she ran on, as she always does, another referendum. I mean, I just hope that you got to go to it last time. I hope we can both be allowed to go over and watch it this time.
Marcella?
Yeah, well, they said the voting turnout's quite high. Like a lot of other COVID elections we've seen in the Western world, a lot of people voted in advance, obviously, by mail. So to Andrew's point, it's a little bit weird that they can't count votes overnight. I think there's no question about a second referendum, but I think they're going to have to wait till COVID's a little bit more over. And it might be, Boris Johnson might appreciate taking some focus on himself to have a little fight with Scotland about whether or not they get to have a second referendum, right? Because basically Sturgeon's saying, I'll force it through and let him fight me in the courts. Well, that might not be a bad distraction for him. He's got some big problems on his plate right now.
They could do with a Clarity Act, I think, like we have. It is ironic that it'll be interesting to see the turnout, because the turnout has been very poor, 55% in the last election in 2016. It'll be interesting to see whether it's higher with a mail-in vote. A lot of the criticism of from the anti-independence side was that a majority of a minority or of 50% is not a mandate to go to a referendum. So we will see.
Apparently the weather today there is dreich, I guess you would say, so that might not help.
There's there's even snow up in the north, so so maybe probably just as well they're not trying to count ballots overnight. Anyway, guys, thank you very much again. We will do it all over again this time next week. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.